In every history classroom across the world, there's a map on the wall. Ancient empires rise and fall, borders shift like sand, civilizations bloom and crumble. But what if I told you that the largest empire in human history was deliberately erased from every single one of those maps? What if an entire civilization that once spanned continents simply vanished from the official record, leaving behind only whispers and architectural riddles that still haunt our cities today? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most explosive alternative history theories circulating online, the Tartaria Files. A rabbit hole so deep, so controversial, that even mentioning it gets you labeled a conspiracy theorist. But here's the thing, the evidence isn't hidden in some dusty archive or secret government facility. It's right there, on street corners, in photographs your great-grandfather took, in buildings you walk past every single day without asking the obvious question, who really built these magnificent structures, and why does the official story make absolutely no sense? They call it the Great Reset. Not the one politicians talk about today, but something far more devastating, a mud flood that supposedly buried entire cities, a coordinated campaign to wipe an advanced civilization from human memory, star forts scattered across every continent that defy conventional military logic, world's fairs that showcased impossible architecture, only to tear it all down months later. And at the center of it all, Tartaria, a name that once covered the largest landmass on Earth, stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, a place that appeared on official maps for centuries, until suddenly it didn't. A civilization so advanced that their buildings still stand today, mislabeled as the work of others, their true creators scrubbed from every textbook, every timeline, every official account. You've seen the evidence without knowing it. Those basement windows that sit at ground level, those massive doors that open to nothing but soil, those impossibly ornate buildings in remote locations where no advanced civilization was supposed to exist. The photographs from the 1800s showing empty city streets lined with architectural marvels that we're told were built by horse and buggy societies with hand tools. But here's what makes this theory so unsettling. It's not asking you to believe in aliens or ancient gods. It's asking you to consider that human civilization was far more advanced just 2 centuries ago than we've been told. That the Industrial Revolution wasn't the beginning of our technological age, but a rebuilding period after something catastrophic wiped the slate clean. That our ancestors weren't primitive pioneers struggling to tame the wilderness, but survivors of a global empire that controlled technology we can barely comprehend today. The rabbit hole begins with a simple observation. Look at any major city built in the 1800s. The architecture is impossible, not just impressive impossible. Massive stone structures with intricate carvings, perfect symmetry, and engineering that rivals anything we build today, all supposedly constructed by societies that hadn't invented the electric light bulb yet, by people who traveled by horseback and communicated by letter, by civilizations that we're told were just emerging from medieval darkness. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 serves as ground zero for these questions. In just 2 years, workers supposedly built what became known as the White City, 200 temporary neoclassical buildings covering over 600 acres, structures so magnificent that visitors wept at their beauty. Architecture so advanced that it inspired the City Beautiful movement that reshaped American urban planning for generations. And then, when the fair ended, they tore it all down. Every single building. Demolished, burned, erased. The official explanation? These were temporary structures, built cheaply and painted to look like marble. Staff spray-painted plaster to create the illusion of grandeur. But photographs tell a different story. The White City didn't look temporary. It looked eternal. It looked like it belonged to a civilization that understood architecture as both art and technology in ways we've forgotten. And Chicago wasn't unique. World's fairs across the globe showcased impossible architecture that vanished as soon as the crowds went home. Paris, San Francisco, Street, Louis, each fair featured buildings that seemed to have been designed by master architects with unlimited resources and advanced construction techniques, buildings that took decades to plan and months to demolish. Always demolished, never preserved, always explained away as temporary exhibitions. But the architectural mysteries extend far beyond world's fairs. Every buildings that Don major city contains fit the official timeline. Structures supposedly built by local craftsmen that share identical design elements with buildings thousands of miles away. The same domed capitals, the same ornate facades, the same impossible precision in stonework and metalwork, as if a single civilization had left its signature across their other star forts, the entire globe. Then geometric fortifications with perfect symmetry scattered across every continent, from Morocco to Vietnam, from Baltimore to Russia. These angular structures appear wherever European influence supposedly spread. The official explanation claims they represent the evolution of military engineering during the Gunpowder Age, but that explanation falls apart under scrutiny. Why would isolated cultures develop identical designs? Why build such massive fortifications in locations with no strategic military value? Why do so many sit on what researchers call ley lines, alleged energy pathways that crisscross the Earth? The star forts raise uncomfortable questions about the official narrative of global exploration and colonization. We're told that European powers spread their architectural knowledge through conquest and trade. But what if it was the reverse? What if these structures predated European expansion and were simply claimed by whoever found them? What if the age of exploration was really an age of rediscovery, with navigators mapping the remnants of a civilization that had already connected the world? This is where the mud flood theory enters the picture. Believers claim that sometime in the early 1800s, a global catastrophe buried entire cities under layers of mud and sediment. The evidence, they argue, is everywhere. Buildings with windows at ground level that were clearly designed to be above ground. Doors that open onto soil. Tunnel systems beneath major cities that suggest multiple levels of civilization buried beneath our feet. Urban archaeologists dismiss these observations with conventional explanations. Cities change over time. Street levels rise and fall. New construction covers old foundations. Buildings get modified, repurposed, partially demolished. What looks like evidence of a mud flood is really just the natural evolution of urban landscapes over centuries. But believers in the Tartarian theory see something more sinister. They see evidence of deliberate erasure, a coordinated effort to bury the past and rewrite history. They point to the massive construction projects of the 1800s, not as evidence of industrial progress, but as a cleanup operation. Railroad construction that moved impossible amounts of earth. Urban renewal projects that demolished historic buildings. Infrastructure development that seemed designed more to bury the past than build the future. The name itself, Tartaria, adds another layer to the mystery. It wasn't a conspiracy theory invention. Tartaria appeared on official maps for centuries, representing a vast region of Central Asia and Siberia. European cartographers used the term to describe lands they knew existed but couldn't fully explore. Places where powerful empires supposedly held sway over territories larger than entire continents. The historical Tartaria encompassed regions we now call Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Siberia, and parts of Eastern Europe. It was real geography with real peoples: Mongols, Turkic tribes, Slavic populations, and countless other ethnic groups. But in the hands of modern conspiracy theorists, this legitimate geographical term has been transformed into something far more grandiose. A lost empire, a hidden civilization, a global power that once unified humanity under a single architectural and technological standard in the 1970s. The transformation begins with the work of Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko. His new chronology theory claimed that conventional history was artificially stretched, and that most events we attribute to ancient civilizations actually occurred during the medieval period. According to Fomenko, a powerful empire he called the Russian Horde once controlled much of the known world, and evidence of this empire was systematically suppressed by later powers, including the Vatican and various European dynasties. From these academic roots, the Tartarian theory evolved through online communities into something even more ambitious. No longer confined to challenging medieval chronology, modern believers claim that Tartaria represents a recently lost civilization, not thousands of years ago, but centuries. Not prehistoric, but within the documented historical period. A civilization so advanced and so recently destroyed that evidence of its existence should be everywhere, and according to believers, it island. The theory gained explosive momentum in 2016 when YouTubers began sharing images that seemed to defy explanation. Photographs from the late 1800s showing massive construction projects that moved mountains of earth. Before and after shots of cities where entire districts appeared to have been excavated from underground. Buildings that seemed to emerge from soil rather than being constructed on top of it. These weren't grainy, questionable images. They were official photographs from municipal archives, documentation from railroad companies, government surveys. The kind of evidence that historians typically use to support conventional narratives, except these images seemed to support something else entirely. They showed a world in the process of being literally unearthed. Take San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake and fire. Official accounts describe the disaster as devastating but focus on the fire damage to wooden structures. Yet photographs from the aftermath show something peculiar. Massive stone buildings that appear to have been partially buried, with their lower floors completely underground. Structures that look like they were excavated rather than destroyed. Debris patterns that suggest digging operations more than fire damage. The believers ask uncomfortable questions. Why would you bury perfectly good buildings instead of repairing them? Why do so many post-disaster photographs show excavation equipment rather than construction machinery? Why do the rebuilding efforts look more like archaeological digs than urban renewal projects? Similar patterns appear in photographs from Chicago after its Great Fire of 1871, New York, during its various urban development phases, European cities during their massive 19th century renovation projects. Always the same story. Disaster strikes. Massive earth-moving operations follow. New construction rises from what looks like excavated foundations rather than cleared lots. But perhaps the most compelling photographic evidence comes from the world's fairs themselves. Not just the magnificent buildings that were supposedly temporary, but the crowds, or rather, the lack of crowds. Photograph after photograph shows these architectural marvels sitting nearly empty. Streets that should be packed with visitors appear almost deserted. Buildings designed to accommodate thousands, showing only scattered groups of people. The official attendance numbers tell a different story. The Chicago World's Fair allegedly drew over 27 million visitors during its 6-month run. That's roughly 150,000 people per day, in an era when the entire population of the United States was only 63 million. Yet the photographs show empty boulevards and vacant plazas surrounding buildings that supposedly attracted unprecedented crowds. This discrepancy has led some researchers to question whether these World's Fairs were really exhibitions at all. What if they were something else? What if they were showcasing existing architecture rather than displaying new construction? What if the temporary buildings were actually permanent structures that predated the fairs themselves? The demolition photographs add another layer of mystery. When these supposedly temporary structures were torn down, the debris patterns look wrong. Instead of finding hollow plaster shells painted to look like stone, Workers discovered solid masonry. Instead of cheap wood frames, they found advanced steel construction. Instead of surface-level foundations, they uncovered deep underground chambers and tunnel systems. City records from the period describe massive disposal operations. Trainloads of stone and metal being carted away from fair sites. Underground chambers being filled with debris. Tunnel systems being sealed with concrete. All for buildings that were supposedly made of temporary materials. The technology question becomes even more puzzling when you examine the construction timelines. The Chicago World's Fair was announced in 1890, with construction beginning in 1891. 2 years to build 200 elaborate structures covering 600 acres. 2 years to create architecture so sophisticated that it influenced urban planning for generations, all with 1,890 seconds technology, all with hand tools, steam shovels, and horse-drawn carts. Modern construction experts who've analyzed the photographs point out impossibilities in these timelines. The precision of the stonework alone would have required decades of skilled craftsmanship. The engineering of the largest buildings would have demanded calculations and materials science that weren't fully developed until the 20th century. The infrastructure to support such massive construction, the railroads to bring materials, the housing for thousands of workers, the coordination of dozens of simultaneous projects would have been a logistical nightmare that stretched the capabilities of any 1,890 seconds organization. Yet the photographic record shows these buildings rising from the ground with startling speed, time-lapse sequences of construction that seem to show structures appearing rather than being built. Workers who look more like they're uncovering existing foundations than laying new ones. Excavation operations that dwarf the construction work itself. The Tartarian believers see this as evidence that these weren't construction projects but recovery operations. Not building something new, but revealing something old. Not creating architectural marvels, but unearthing them from a previous civilization that had been buried by the mysterious mud flood. The mud flood theory itself rests on geological observations that mainstream science struggles to explain satisfactorily. Sediment layers in major cities that suggest rapid deposition rather than gradual accumulation. Buried structures that show no signs of having been intentionally covered. Archaeological anomalies where artifacts from different historical periods appear in the same undisturbed layers. Urban planners know that cities evolve over time. Street levels change, buildings get modified, new construction covers old foundations. But the patterns that Tartarian researchers have documented go beyond normal urban evolution. They show evidence of sudden, massive earth movement. Entire city blocks that appear to have been buried in single events rather than gradual processes. The official explanations focus on known phenomena: flooding, landslides, industrial fill operations, urban renewal projects that raised street levels. All perfectly reasonable explanations for individual cases, but taken together, the pattern suggests something more systematic, something coordinated, something that happened across multiple continents during roughly the same historical period. Climate records from the early 1800s do show unusual weather patterns. The year without a summer in 1816, volcanic eruptions that affected global weather, unusual storm systems and flooding events, natural disasters that could have triggered the kind of massive earth movement that Tartarian believers claim as evidence for their mud flood. But natural disasters don't explain the coordinated response. The simultaneous urban renewal projects across multiple continents, the nearly identical architectural recoveries in cities thousands of miles apart, the systematic documentation and then destruction of the recovered structures, the careful preservation of some buildings and the deliberate demolition of others. This is where the theory takes its darkest turn. What if the disasters weren't natural at all? What if the wars, floods, and fires of the 19th and early 20th centuries were deliberately orchestrated to complete the erasure. The Napoleonic Wars that reshaped European cities, the American Civil War that devastated entire regions, World War I that bombed historic centers across Europe. Each conflict followed by massive reconstruction projects that looked suspiciously like cleanup operations. The timing is too convenient. Major urban disasters followed immediately by earth-moving projects on unprecedented scales. Railroad construction that moved billions of tons of soil, canal digging that rerouted rivers and drained wetlands, mining operations that stripped entire mountainsides. All justified as industrial progress, but all accomplishing the same goal, burying whatever remained of the previous civilization. Consider the scale of these operations. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad moved more earth than the Panama Canal. Urban renewal projects in cities like Paris and London demolished entire districts and rebuilt them from scratch. The expansion of the American frontier involved earth-moving operations that dwarfed anything attempted before or since. All within a few decades, all using supposedly primitive technology, all documented with photographs that show the results but never quite explain the methods. The photographic evidence becomes even more disturbing when you examine it closely. Workers in these images don't look like construction crews building something new. They look like archaeological teams excavating something old. The tools they're using aren't construction equipment, they're digging implements. The materials they're handling aren't raw building supplies, they're carved stones and finished architectural elements being removed from excavation sites. Railroad construction photographs are particularly revealing. Instead of showing crews laying track across virgin wilderness, they show massive excavation operations, cuts through hills that reveal elaborate stonework, tunnels that connect to existing underground chambers, bridge foundations that incorporate architectural elements that clearly predate the railroad itself, as if the railroad wasn't being built through empty land, but through the ruins of a previous civilization. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 provides another case study in suspicious timing. The fire supposedly started in a barn and spread through wooden structures. But photographs from the aftermath show something different. Massive stone buildings reduced to rubble, underground chambers filled with debris, street levels that appear to have been deliberately raised during the rebuilding process, and construction operations that look more like archaeological expeditions than urban renewal projects. Similar patterns appear in every major 19th century disaster: the San Francisco earthquake, the Great Fire of London, the bombardment of European cities during various wars. Always the same sequence. Disaster strikes. Massive cleanup operations follow. New construction rises from foundations that seem far too elaborate for the supposedly primitive societies that built them. And always, the cleanup operations move more earth than the construction projects themselves. The believers ask why. Why would anyone orchestrate such a massive cover-up? What was so threatening about Tartarian civilization that it had to be erased not just from maps, but from physical reality? The answer, according to the theory, lies in the technology. Tartarian architecture wasn't just beautiful, it was functional. These buildings weren't just decorative monuments, they were machines. The domed structures that appear in every major city weren't just architectural flourishes, they were energy collectors. The elaborate metalwork that covers these buildings wasn't decoration, it was circuitry. The geometric patterns carved into stone weren't artistic choices, they were technical specifications for technologies we no longer understand. The star forts scattered across continents weren't military installations, they were power generation facilities connected by underground networks that spanned the globe. This is where the theory ventures into territory that conventional science can't easily dismiss or explain, because the architectural elements that believers point to as evidence of lost technology do exhibit properties that seem to go beyond mere decoration. The metalwork on Tartarian buildings does show electromagnetic properties. The geometric patterns do follow mathematical principles that suggest advanced understanding of physics and engineering. The acoustic properties of domed structures do indicate sophisticated knowledge of sound manipulation. Modern researchers studying these buildings have found anomalies that traditional architecture can't explain. Rooms with perfect acoustic properties that amplify or dampen sound in ways that seem impossible without advanced understanding of wave physics. Metal fixtures that show signs of electrical conductivity, despite predating the supposed invention of electrical systems. Stone carvings that incorporate mathematical constants and geometric relationships that weren't officially discovered until centuries later. The underground tunnel systems beneath major cities present another puzzle. These aren't simple sewage or utility tunnels. They're elaborate networks of chambers and passageways that seem designed for purposes no one can identify. The construction techniques show advanced engineering. The materials include substances that don't match local geology. The layout follows patterns that suggest systematic planning on a massive scale. In Paris, the catacombs extend far beyond their official mapped boundaries. Exploration teams have discovered chambers with architectural elements that don't match any known period of construction. Stonework that uses techniques supposedly unknown to European builders. Tunnel connections that link to buildings with no official record of basement construction. Underground spaces that seem designed for purposes that conventional history can't explain. Similar discoveries have been made beneath cities worldwide. New York's underground infrastructure includes chambers and tunnels that predate official city planning. London's sewer system incorporates architectural elements that don't match Victorian construction techniques. Moscow's metro system revealed underground spaces that existed before any recorded construction began. Always the same pattern. Elaborate underground networks that seem to predate the cities above them. The technology question becomes even more intriguing when you examine the power systems these buildings seem to have used. Conventional history tells us that electricity wasn't harnessed until the late 1800s, but Tartarian buildings show evidence of electrical systems that predate Edison by decades. Wire conduits built into the walls, metal fixtures designed to conduct current. Architectural elements that only make sense if they were part of an electrical grid. The World's Fairs themselves may have been demonstrations of this lost technology. Not just exhibitions of architecture, but working displays of power systems that the general public was no longer supposed to understand. The massive electrical installations at these fairs were explained as temporary lighting systems, but photographs show electrical infrastructure on a scale that rivals modern power grids. Generator systems that could supply entire cities. Distribution networks that connected hundreds of buildings across vast exhibition sites. And then, when the fairs ended, all of this infrastructure vanished. Not just the buildings, but the power systems. Not just the architecture, but the technology. As if the real purpose of the fairs was to demonstrate what had been lost, and then to make sure it stayed lost. The demolition photographs become even more suspicious when viewed from this perspective. Workers aren't just tearing down temporary buildings, they're systematically dismantling advanced technology, removing electrical systems, disconnecting power networks, destroying infrastructure that took decades to develop and install, all under the guise of cleaning up after temporary exhibitions. The timing of the Industrial Revolution itself becomes questionable. Why did technological advancement suddenly accelerate in the 1800s? Why did multiple inventors across different continents simultaneously develop similar technologies? Why did the pace of innovation increase so dramatically during the same period that these massive earth-moving and construction projects were taking place? What if the Industrial Revolution wasn't the beginning of our technological age, but a period of rediscovery? What if inventors like Edison, Tesla, and Bell weren't creating new technologies, but reverse engineering systems they found in the ruins of Tartarian civilization? What if the rapid technological progress of the 1800s was possible, because the blueprints already existed, buried under the mud flood, waiting to be excavated and understood. This perspective reframes every major technological breakthrough of the period. The telephone becomes not an invention, but a rediscovery. The electric light bulb becomes not a creation, but a reproduction. The power grid becomes not an innovation, but a reconstruction of systems that once connected the entire globe under Tartarian control. The patent system itself shows suspicious patterns during this period. Multiple inventors filing similar designs within months of each other. Technologies appearing simultaneously in different countries, with no evidence of communication between inventors. Breakthroughs that seem to emerge, fully formed without the typical development process that characterizes genuine innovation. Edison's laboratories, Tesla's workshops, Bell's research facilities, all located in areas where major excavation projects had recently taken place, all producing technologies that seemed to advance impossibly quickly from concept to working prototype, all developing systems that integrated seamlessly with infrastructure that supposedly hadn't existed before. Their inventions made it necessary. The corporate entities that emerged during this period show another suspicious pattern. Railroad companies that became real estate developers, mining operations that became manufacturing conglomerates, construction firms that became technology corporations, always the same progression. Companies that began by moving earth and ended by producing advanced technology, as if the real business wasn't construction or mining, but recovery and reverse engineering of Tartarian systems. The financial backing for these operations raises additional questions. Where did the enormous capital required for these projects come from? Railroad construction that cost billions in today's money. Urban renewal projects that reshaped entire cities. Industrial facilities that required resources on unprecedented scales. All funded by banking systems that had supposedly just emerged from primitive agricultural economies. The concentration of wealth during this period defies conventional economic models. Fortunes that appeared seemingly overnight. Industrial empires that grew from small regional operations to global corporations within single decades. Financial networks that connected investors across continents, despite communication systems that moved at the speed of sailing ships and horse-drawn mail. What if this wasn't new wealth creation, but wealth recovery? What if the great fortunes of the Industrial Revolution came not from innovation and entrepreneurship, but from salvaging the remains of Tartarian civilization? What if the robber barons weren't building new empires, but claiming existing infrastructure and rebranding it as their own creation? The transportation networks that emerged during this period show patterns that support this theory. Railroads that followed routes through terrain that seemed impossibly difficult for 1800s engineering. Canals that connected water systems across vast distances with precision that required advanced surveying techniques. Road networks that linked population centers with mathematical efficiency that suggests systematic planning on a continental scale. These transportation systems didn't emerge gradually through organic development. They appeared rapidly, as complete networks, during a brief historical period when the technology to plan and construct such systems supposedly didn't exist. As if someone was following blueprints for infrastructure that had already been designed and partially built by a previous civilization. The communication networks show similar patterns. Telegraph lines that followed routes that seemed to anticipate future population centers. Postal systems that connected remote locations with efficiency that required detailed geographic knowledge. Information networks that functioned with precision that belied their supposedly improvised origins. All of this infrastructure appeared during the same historical period, when massive earth-moving operations were taking place across multiple continents, when major cities were being excavated and rebuilt, when architectural marvels were being displayed at world's fairs and then systematically destroyed, when the official story claims that primitive societies were bootstrapping themselves into the modern age through pure innovation and determination, but the photographic evidence tells a different story. It shows a world in the process of recovering from catastrophe, not building something new, but salvaging something old, not creating advanced civilization, but reconstructing it from fragments of something that had been deliberately buried and systematically erased from official memory. The question remains, who orchestrated this massive operation? Who had the resources and coordination to execute a global cover-up on this scale? Who decided that Tartarian civilization was too dangerous to acknowledge, too advanced to allow, too powerful to permit its restoration? The answer may lie not in the halls of government or the boardrooms of corporations, but in the quiet corridors of academic institutions and religious hierarchies that had spent centuries carefully crafting the official narrative of human progress. Consider the timeline. The systematic erasure of Tartarian civilization coincided perfectly with the rise of modern universities, the standardization of textbooks, and the establishment of official historical curricula that would shape how future generations understood their past. The Vatican's role becomes particularly intriguing when you examine the pattern of destruction. Many of the buildings attributed to Tartarian architecture were religious in nature, cathedrals, churches, temples that showed architectural sophistication that predated official Christian construction in those regions. What if these structures represented a different kind of spirituality, a technological approach to consciousness and energy that threatened established religious authority? The timing of archaeological expeditions during the 1800s reveals another suspicious pattern. Just as massive earth-moving operations were burying evidence of Tartarian civilization, official archaeological teams were being dispatched to distant lands to excavate and catalogue ancient ruins that fit the approved narrative. Egyptian pyramids that supported biblical timelines, Mesopotamian ruins that confirmed classical historical accounts, Greek and Roman artifacts that validated the progression from primitive to civilized that educators wanted to teach. But the archaeological teams consistently avoided investigating the anomalies in their own backyard, the buried structures beneath European cities, the impossible construction timelines of American infrastructure, the technological sophistication of buildings that supposedly predated the Renaissance, as if their job wasn't to discover truth, but to redirect attention away from inconvenient evidence. The publishing industry shows similar coordination during this period. History textbooks that appeared simultaneously across different countries, all telling identical stories about human progress and technological development. Educational materials that ignored architectural achievements that didn't fit the approved timeline. Academic journals that refused to publish research questioning the conventional narrative of civilization's advancement. This wasn't accidental coordination. The standardization of historical education required careful planning and substantial resources. Someone was funding the creation of curricula that would ensure future generations never asked the right questions about their architectural heritage. Someone was training teachers to dismiss obvious anomalies as unworthy of investigation. Someone was creating a system of intellectual gatekeeping that would protect the cover-up for generations. The museum system that emerged during the same period shows another layer of control. Institutions that claimed to preserve historical artifacts while systematically excluding anything that contradicted the approved narrative. Collections that focused on primitive tools and decorative objects while ignoring the technological sophistication of architectural remains. Exhibitions that celebrated human progress while carefully avoiding display of anything that suggested advanced prehistoric civilizations. When Tartarian artifacts did make it into museum collections, they were invariably mislabeled, misdated, or attributed to cultures that fit the established timeline. Stone carvings showing advanced geometric knowledge were classified as decorative art. Metal fixtures displaying electrical properties were catalogued as ceremonial objects. Architectural elements suggesting systematic engineering were described as accidental achievements of primitive builders. The academic career system that developed during this period created powerful incentives for scholars to avoid controversial research. Tenure, funding, and professional advancement all depended on supporting the established historical narrative. Researchers who questioned conventional timelines found themselves marginalized, defunded, and excluded from prestigious institutions. The message was clear: investigate approved topics or find another career. Whether Tartaria was a magnificent lost empire or simply a geographical term twisted by modern imagination, one thing remains undeniable. The questions surrounding our architectural heritage refuse to disappear. From buried windows to impossible construction timelines, from demolished World's Fair marvels to underground tunnel networks that predate the cities above them, the evidence continues to whisper of mysteries our textbooks never taught us to see. Perhaps the real power of the Tartaria theory isn't in proving a conspiracy, but in forcing us to look more carefully at the world around us, to question the stories we've inherited, to wonder what other chapters of human achievement might be hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone curious enough to ask why that beautiful building looks so impossible, so out of place, so deliberately forgotten. The maps may have been redrawn, but the stones remember. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.